So hello everybody, my name is Ali-Reza Omidvar. Welcome to the St Andrews Psychedelic Society. We have an amazing guest today, Dr. Rick Strassman, who is the foremost scientist in the realm of DMT research. And he's an American clinical associate professor of psychiatry at the University of New Mexico School of Medicine. He has held a fellowship in clinical psychopharmacology research at the University of California, San Diego, and was a professor of psychiatry for 11 years at the University of New Mexico. After 20 years of intermission, Dr. Strassman was the first person in the United States to undertake human research with psychedelic substances. With his research on N,N-dimethyltryptamine, also known as DMT. He's also the author of DMT, Spirit Molecule, which has sold 250,000 copies as of mid-2021 and has been translated into over a dozen languages. He co-produced an independent documentary by the same name, which was the most streamed independent drug documentary on Netflix. He's also the author of DMT and the Soul of Prophecy, and a co-founder of Inner Path to Outer Space. He has published over 40 peer-reviewed scientific papers and has served as a reviewer for 20 psychiatric research journals. He has been a consultant to the U.S. Food and Drug Administration, National Institute on Drug Abuse, Veterans Administration hospitals, Social Security Administration, and other state and local agencies. So the structure for today's event begins with a 40-minute presentation given by amazing Dr. Strassman, and then we move to a panel discussion, and the panelists are myself and Zahar, who is the president of the St Andrews Psychedelic Society, and then we'll open to the questions the last 20 minutes for you guys to interact with Dr. Strassman one-to-one. So thank you so much, Dr. Strassman, for joining us. We're so excited to have you today.
Thank you. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. My pleasure to be here. Yeah, we were talking earlier about a couple of weeks I spent in Scotland in the 90s, and I really loved my time there. Very green, very wet, very friendly, good beer, good scotch, good seafood. Okay, let me get the sharing going here. Okay, so I'll mostly be focusing today on DMT, and it's the first well-known naturally produced psychedelic. It's an endogenous compound, which makes it unique, and it's amazing on how little research is actually going on with respect to DMT, especially its role in the brain. Okay, psychedelic drugs in general are easily the most interesting in psychiatry. That they affect all components of consciousness, not simply one or two elements. They modify mood, thinking, perception, especially visual, body awareness, and sense of self and self-control, as compared to, let's say, the stimulants, which might just improve mood and attention, or the sedative hypnotics that might make you sleepy or are anti-anxiety in their properties. So the structure of DMT, it's very simple. It's the simplest, prototypical, tryptamine psychedelic. It has an indole ring and a short carbon chain with an amine group on the end. Its molecular weight is barely over the weight of glucose. It's 188. Is its molecular weight compared to glucose, which is 180. So the history is kind of roundabout. It was first synthesized in Canada as one of a number of compounds that Mansky was looking at. He never investigated it. He simply established its route of synthesis. It was discovered in psychedelic root barks by the Brazilians in the 1940s and the 1950s. But it was only one of a number of compounds that were isolated from that bark. it was likewise isolated by a couple of American chemists not much longer, or not much after that. And in their case, it was isolated as one of a number of compounds from psychedelic seeds that were used in snuffs. The discovery of DMT's psychological effects required another couple of years. It occurred in Budapest by Stephen Zara, who was interested in studying LSD back then, but because Hungary was behind the Iron Curtain, he wasn't able to import LSD. So he went to the library, discovered DMT, made himself some, and he took increasingly large oral doses without an effect, and then thought, well, maybe it needs to be injected. So he gave himself some intramuscular DMT, and voila, the psychedelic effects of DMT were discovered. He and his group performed non-blind studies in both normals and patients with psychosis in order to characterize the effects of the drug, its metabolism, the similarities and the differences between the symptoms of the DMT state and the symptoms of, say, schizophrenia. It remained an obscure compound. It wasn't even used that much on the street. It received a mixed reputation. Some people called it the businessman's trip, because theoretically you could smoke it at lunch and then go back to work. But other people found it terrifying. Bill Burroughs, Tim Leary, they weren't all that fond of it. It was a bit too scary, because of the rapidity of the onset, the dissociation, and the intensity of the effects. Interest began growing in DMT once it was discovered to be a component of mammalian tissues, blood, urine, spinal fluid, and it was seen to be capable of being synthesized in the mammal as well. Interest began with a rabbit lung, but as the years have gone by, people have focused more and more on the brain. It was then discovered in human urine and human blood. So that began a search for its potential role in psychopathology, specifically, psychosis in particular. It's very difficult to measure in the blood. Concentrations are down to picograms per milliliter. So even though there were dozens of papers reporting presence of DMT in the blood or urine or spinal fluid of humans, in a way, those results could be seen to be suspect because of assay problems. So there is interest in other ways of looking at the activity of the DMT synthetic mechanism in mammals and in humans in particular. The synthesis in vivo is quite simple. Dietary tryptophan is converted to tryptamine, which is then dimethylated to DMT using S-adenylyl methionine as the methyl donor. It used to be believed, that the crucial enzyme was indole ethyl was indolamine and methyltransferase, or INMT. But just recently, it was discovered that knockout rats who don't produce any INMT still make DMT. So there must be an alternative pathway. The metabolism is Mm, Um, in everyday, metabolism, it's nonspecific. Under the effect of MAOA, it's metabolized to 3-indole acetic acid. But there are a number of other compounds which are metabolized, to this compound. So you really can't measure, the turnover of DMT by looking at 3-indole acetic acid. If you inhibit MAOA, though, like in ayahuasca, for example, there's an alternative metabolic pathway, to DMT N oxide, which is specific to DMT. We did a little study a few years back, a grad student at UC Berkeley who gave a number of normal volunteers an MAO inhibitor for a few days. But we weren't able, to see any increase in the N oxide or, DMT itself. So this is a minor metabolic pathway, which is turned on, when you've got major ayahuasca intake in combination with an MAO inhibitor like in ayahuasca. So the early research with DMT was looking at it as an endogenous psychotogen, which was part of the transmethylation theory of schizophrenia. In other words, schizophrenics methylated tryptamine abnormally. So the emphasis was on psychosis, comparing concentrations of DMT with those in schizophrenia, comparing the effects of DMT in controls with schizophrenics, to see if schizophrenic symptoms were enhanced by DMT or were similar to DMT or were different, the visual effects, the affective effects. Because if they were similar, you could say, well, maybe schizophrenics are producing too much DMT. Comparing MAO activity, perhaps schizophrenics weren't able to metabolize DMT compared to normals. The lack of tolerance at that time, studied in both cats and in humans, supported the notion of DMT in schizophrenia. In other words, if you became tolerant to DMT after a while, you would no longer experience psychotic, in quotes, kinds of symptoms, which would be consistent with a waxing, waning, chronic time course of schizophrenia. There was also interest in developing anti-DMTs as antipsychotic agents, either drugs or antibodies. Um, there wasn't much therapeutic use of DMT or of its congeners. There were none with DMT actually. There were a couple of studies with dipropyltryptamine at Spring Grove in Baltimore, for alcoholism and end of life care. And also, I think at NIMH and at Spring Grove, there were some DET studies, diethyltryptamine in alcoholics. And, like everything else, these early studies were quite promising until the passage of the Controlled Substances Act, which kind of brought all clinical research to a screeching halt in 1970. Even though human studies ended at that point, there were still many advances in the basic sciences. These were mostly with LSD, and LSD was responsible basically for the characterization of the different subtypes of the serotonin receptor. Also, the development of of the SSRIs, and even the second generation antipsychotics like risperidone and olanzapine. What we learned at that point was that psychedelics affect primarily the 2A site, the serotonin 2A site. There may be additional roles for the 1A and the 1C site. And some glutamate effects start occurring downstream once the 2A receptors are activated. The models in animals were behavioral. In other words, in the rat, you could teach a rat to discriminate LSD, from saline, and you can give a new drug, and if the rodent responded as if it were being given LSD, the bar pressing would be quite a bit. And if the effects in the rat were closer to saline, it wouldn't bar press. More currently, it's the mouse head twitch response, which is supposed to correlate with human behavioral effects. Neuroendocrine effects were also being studied back then, and that was our model when we performed our work in the 90s. Behavioral, subjective effects, and neuroendocrine ones. So I got interested in this work as a college student, actually. I had my own experiences. My friends were all having their own experiences. And I was also becoming interested in Eastern meditative techniques, which in expert practitioners would produce a lot of similar effects as to those that were being described by psychedelic users. Like out of body experiences, near death visions, voices, ecstasy, terror, new ideas, those kinds of things. So well, plus, it wasn't only me. Psychosis overlapped with the psychedelic effects, spiritual experiences, the near death state. So it seemed as if there must be some common biological denominator, which was activated in a near-death experience, for example, and taking psychedelic drugs. So if one part of the brain is turned on or turned off with an NDE, and that that same area could be turned on or turned off by LSD. So to the extent that to the extent that giving or administering psychedelics replicated features of the non-drug altered state, psychosis, meditative effects, those kinds of things, you could speculate that those naturally occurring compounds may play a role in those non-drug states. So that was one of the motivations that I brought to bear on my studies, which was if you just gave DMT, was it pharmacologically a spiritual compound? Was it entheogenic? So I was interested in if you gave DMT, would it produce spiritual experiences? That wasn't the rationale of my studies and the grants I received, but it was an implicit specific aim. So after 2 years of interacting with the powers that be, I was able to begin my studies in the in November 1990, and we wrapped up in September 1995. The funding came from the Scottish Rite Foundation for Schizophrenia Research, which is a branch of the Masons, actually. And they are interested in the overlap between psychosis and the DMT effect, and the presence of DMT in the blood. And also, we got funding from the National Institute on Drug Abuse, and from that perspective, I emphasized that people were still taking psychedelics. DMT was a prototype. There were a lot of advances in animal research with these drugs, but we needed to confirm or refute or modify those data or those models in the human. Also, I was keen on developing a new questionnaire for the DMT effect. Most of the older questionnaires were either psychopathologically, biased, looking for overlap between psychedelic effects and psychosis, or else we're, theological, like the mystical experience, questionnaire. So I was interested in a more, phenomenological, questionnaire. So we studied, 50 plus normal volunteers. They were, healthy, stable, educated, had a strong social network. They were all experienced with, some psychedelics. Only one or two were experienced, taking DMT. This, was back in the day when, not many people knew about DMT. It was a, bare bones, psychopharmacology, dose response, study, phase one study. Is this, what are the effects of this drug in normal volunteers? And we weren't, doing therapy. We weren't, trying, to induce any, particular, kind of state, either psychosis or mystical state. It was just, we're going to give you the drug. It works very quickly. You may feel like you've lost awareness of your body. Don't worry, you're safe. Just describe what is, going on once you come down. Keep your wits about you, and and we will be here, to talk about it afterwards. So we gave the fumarate salt of DMT. Pretty much every other older, study with the drug gave it intramuscularly. The one IV study, very scary study. It occurred in schizophrenics, and caused a cardiac arrest in the one poor schizophrenic lady that got IV DMT. So we figured we would, begin with IM, and we began with, two subjects who had smoked DMT before recreationally, and they described it as just, slower onset, not as intense and longer lasting, than the smoked. And because our, funding, came, from the, from an institute interested in, drug abuse, we were interested in, replicating, the effect in the field. So we then, switched to IV. Uh, 0 0.1 milligram per kilogram, 0.2. So then, I called, the FDA, and, said, well, people aren't, quite, there at 0.2. What should we do? So they said, well, you can, either, double it, or triple it. And I was, feeling, pretty confident. I said, okay, I'll just triple it. Yeah, so we gave, two people 0.6, and it was way too much. They were confused. They were amnestic. They really were uncomfortable. So we ended up, giving 0.05, 0.1, 0.2, and our high dose was, 0.4. We also gave, saline placebo. Um, People, mostly, preferred, 0.3. Nobody dropped out at 0.4, but it was a bit, hair raising. And all the human studies which, followed ours have been using 0.3. Nobody is using 0.4 anymore. The, threshold, for psychedelic effects, when the when the volunteers, would say, I'm tripping now, 0.2. 0.1 was a bit uncomfortable, kind of betwixt and between. 0.5, people, could barely notice. Um, yeah. We gave, screening doses, first, to see, to acclimate, people to the research unit, and the small doses in a couple of people, raised, blood pressure, to the point, that I wasn't, comfortable giving them more. And, then, the next day, we gave them a high dose non-blind in order, to acclimate them, to the highest possible dose. So we gave the drug as an IV push over 30 seconds. We, flushed the line with, sterile saline after that. And, people, began, feeling, the effect within, 15 seconds of the infusion beginning. and were pretty much incommunicado at the 1 minute point. We established, dose response relationships, for the, for the neuro, for the neuroendocrine parameters that we looked at. There's a slew of hormones. There wasn't a dose response effect for either TSH or for melatonin, which was ironic because of all my interest in the pineal gland. There were dose response, there were dose response relationships, for pupil diameter, core temperature, heart rate, and blood pressure. And we succeeded in developing a new questionnaire, which we call the hallucinogen rating scale. It went through a number of iterations. It's now about 110 questions. So experientially, the effects began, as I said, within a few heartbeats. And the first effect was the rush, an inner sense of acceleration, pressure, and anxiety. Then you would lose awareness of your body. And then, for almost everyone, they entered into this world of light, which was more real than real. And it was full of content, bright colors, morphing, spinning, changing, visual objects. And the volunteers were, they maintained, their sense of self. There was no ego dissolution, which is a popular thing nowadays. But there was no ego dissolution, or if there was, it was for just a second or two as they were getting their bearings. But otherwise, it was very busy, very full of content, and the volunteers interacted with that content, more or less. So the beings are interesting. At least half of the volunteers reported some sentient things there, and they could take all manner of appearances. Composed of light. They could be plants, insects, furniture, robots, humans, machines, you name it. They were sentient. They were aware of themselves and of you. They were intelligent. They were very powerful. There was no monkeying around with them. And interactive. You interacted with them. Verbally, mostly telepathically. Physically, they would do things to you, or it would feel that way. And emotionally, they would love you or they scare you, those kinds of things. The information that they conveyed, though, was much less well articulated than their presence and their nature. In other words, even though volunteers could describe in minute detail, this was their color, this was their shape, this is what they did to me, but the information they conveyed wasn't really that deep. It wasn't very well articulated, and in retrospect, it was completely dependent on the individual. A nurse with an interest in the NDE had an NDE. Somebody with some childhood trauma was healed, by the DMT beings. Other people. There was a volunteer who was a software engineer who saw the source code. So it was quite personal. It wasn't really cosmic, and when it was cosmic, it was a bit cliched. Like love is all there is, or there's a natural catastrophe if we don't do some more ecological conservation, or I have to go to this place to camp out. So it was rather primitive compared to the phenomenology itself. So my conclusion was that was that DMT isn't inherently spiritual. It isn't entheogenic. You need a lot more coaching and props and expectation and steering and interacting with people to have a spiritual experience, or an entheogenic one. So it supports the notion of these being mind manifesting or mind disclosing compounds. They basically reveal or make more meaningful things which are already more or less conscious in your mind. So that isn't to say that there aren't new insights, but those insights were already percolating around in your subconscious or your unconscious. So the adverse effects were uh, were I'm sorry. So the adverse effects were rare and short-lived, and manageable. One you know, one fellow developed some panic attacks after his participation in the big dose. Got some help and returned to the study and did fine. There were a couple of episodes of recurrence of depression. One person responded well, to getting back on antidepressants. Somebody else responded well to getting, back into psychotherapy. There were a couple of or a few episodes of nightmarish content, but with skillful clinical management, we were able to help folks work through those. So the questionnaire, it was phenomenological. It was a description of the effect. Lots of questionnaires are developed with the aim in mind in um, quantifying or establishing a state which those researchers believe is causal in how psychedelics work. So for example, the Hopkins group developed the mystical experience questionnaire, which is predicated on their belief in the first place that mystical experiences are good for you. So they developed a questionnaire, and it determines if you've had a complete or incomplete mystical experience. Then you correlate it with your clinical outcome. You can give people psychedelics as well. Give them questionnaires which measure psychosis if you believe that psychedelics are psychotomimetic, and you'll also get high scores for psychosis. So rather than a higher order kind of rating scale, we just wanted the bare bones kind of questionnaire. What does it feel like emotionally? Are you happy? Are you sad? What are the perceptual effects? Are there visual effects? Are things moving around in your field of vision? What's your affect? Are you happy? Are you sad? Are you at peace? Are you scared? Can you attend to ongoing experience both in the world and in your mind? How intense is it? How much can you control the effects? And the questionnaire has got legs. It is continuing to be used. It's appeared in around 60 peer-reviewed papers, and a new version came out a few months back. I collaborated with a grad student in Switzerland, Dr. Calder, and that paper appeared in Biological Psychiatry a few months ago. We used a lot larger database, and what's very interesting is the questionnaire is able to distinguish between different categories of drugs. So psychedelics are a special category. THC, you can characterize it using the questionnaire. Ketamine and other dissociatives, likewise, MDMA, amphetamines, they all have got their profile, which is very cool, because you can give a new drug and you could say, oh, this is like MDMA, or, oh, this is like ketamine. So yeah, I kind of gave my soapbox about improving your point with your questionnaire. So tolerance. It's you cannot develop tolerance to the behavioral effects of DMT in lower animals. Anyway, there was a study giving full doses to cats every 2 hours for 3 weeks straight, and there was no behavioral tolerance. So we thought, well, maybe you need to space injections even closer together. Like if you take LSD every day for a few days, you'll stop responding pretty much. Um, but the half-life of DMT is extremely short. So we thought, well, let's just give it every half hour. So there wasn't any tolerance to the subjective effects. We give 0.3 4 times in the morning. We brought a couple of people in, see if they could manage uh, the ultimate high dose 4 times in a row, but they just couldn't. It was interesting, because even though these were normal volunteers, they found the experience to be therapeutic. They were intoxicated. They'd come down. We'd have 5 to 10 minutes to discuss what happened. Give them another dose. Same thing. Give them a third dose. So they were able to work through things psychologically with that kind of model. So that paper came out in 1996. In the DMT spirit molecule book, I suggest giving the drug as a continuous infusion because of there's lack of tolerance. So a few years later, Andrew Gallimore contacted me, and we wrote a paper, theoretical paper on of how you would give a continuous infusion. And since then, a couple of groups have taken up the challenge and are doing continuous infusion studies in the UK and Switzerland. The 1A site might be playing a role, at least with DMT. If you blockade the 1A receptor in humans, giving pindolol, which is both a beta blocker, but it's also a potent 1A antagonist, you can multiply the subjective effects by a factor of 2. And if you give a 1A stimulant like buspirone, it will decrease psilocybin's effects. So there is a role for the 1A receptor. So, recent developments, there's some in lower animals, there's a group in Hungary that's been doing preclinical work. It's and established that DMT is neuroprotective in ischemia, or in conditions of ischemia in the test tube. Is also nephroprotective in the ischemia reperfusion syndrome in kidneys in vivo. Is anti-inflammatory, sigma-1 agonist, and it reduces experimental stroke size and speeds functional recovery in rodents. There's also increase in neuroplasticity, neurogenesis. Dave Olson at UC Davis is mostly doing this work, and DMT small doses will increase neuroplasticity, increase functional dendritic synaptic connections. There's also interest in non-psychedelic compounds that are neuroplastogens, and there's a congener of DMT which meets those criteria. It's almost called iso-DMT. I'm very interested in what's the role of endogenous DMT, if indeed there is endogenous DMT in any measurable amounts. Most of this work, actually, like all of this work, has come out of the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, Gimo Borjigin's lab, by John Dean, Nick Glinos. So they discovered that the cortex in lower animals makes DMT because of the co-localization of the two necessary enzymes. Concentrations in cortex are as high as those for canonical neurotransmitters like serotonin and dopamine. So it points to the possibility of a DMT neurotransmitter system, which would be very interesting to characterize its role. Concentrations of DMT increase in rodent brain after death, especially visual cortex. They're still starting to begin looking at circadian and um, and your rapid eye movement effects. And as I mentioned earlier, you can knock out the INM, you can knock out the enzyme that is the final step in making DMT, uh, and still make other compound. So there is some alternative pathway you know, for DMT synthesis. Human developments are quite slow with DMT. Psychotherapy, psychotherapeutically, there's a role, because it's much shorter acting. There have been a couple of studies using DMT for depression. There's some UK studies and a Yale study. I understand there's a Yale study now going on, to see if it is helpful in alcoholism. There's a lot of interest in characterizing the drug's effect on functional connectivity. And also, John Dean, who moved over to UC San Diego, is very keen on looking at synthesis of DMT in the living human brain using MR spectroscopy. So right now he's working on visualizing tryptophan in the living human brain. Once that's done, there's tryptamine, and once that's done, there's DMT, and the continuous infusion protocols. So there's a couple going on right now. Uh, there's one that occurred in Germany, but they didn't quite have the infusion protocol nailed down, and I think they gave too much. It was for 90 minutes, and there's no way to find out what those people actually experienced. There's a UK study which is ongoing. Chris Timmerman. So they're fine tuning the model, working on safety, pharmacokinetics. A more like minute to minute description of the phenomenology. Lichty in Switzerland, safety and PK data as well. Both of those groups kind of vaguely state it looks like there's mild tolerance after either a 60-minute or a 90-minute infusion, but they don't present any statistical support for that assertion. It's more that they're looking at the blood levels and the intensity of effect, and they seem to be diverging a bit, but that there's but my reading of their work, it seems to lack many statistical validation of development of tolerance. The advantages of an infusion is it gives you more time to interact with the contents of the DMT world, and especially with the beings. Psychotherapeutic implications as well. You can increase the infusion rate if need be. You can reduce it. You can stop it depending on the needs of the psychotherapeutic moment. So issues in the therapeutic use, what's the route of administration? Do you snort it, IM, IV, sub-Q? The Swiss are experimenting with a very cool model. They're pre-treating with buccal harmaline and then giving a nasal spray of DMT. And the effects are extended for a couple of hours, actually, from what I understand. So that would militate against, or you mitigate the onset of the rush, which can be quite anxiety provoking, number one, and number two, you would have more time in the state if you wanted to do psychotherapy. But psilocybin is 6 to 8 hours, LSD is 12 hours, so 2 hours would be ideal. What's the optimal salt? Is it fumarate, or is it the hemifumarate? And what's the optimal dose? 0.2 is your threshold for psychedelic effects. Contraindications are those which are standard in the field. Psychosis, cardiovascular, seizure disorders, and adverse, drug interactions. What would your DMT be useful, for? I think anything which other psychedelics are establishing, potential utility. It's a long list, uh, but uniquely DMT. If DMT increases in the dying visual cortex, that indicates that DMT at least is involved in some of the phenomenon which occur in the dying brain. So theoretically, would giving DMT provide a dry run for the dying experience? The one concern obviously is if it's a terrible and frightening DMT experience, that could be bad because there isn't much time for repair. So screening doses, I think it's important to give screening doses for the subjective effect, uh, uh, kind of getting people used to that, blood pressure effects. Uh, do you give the drug once? Do you give it several times in the space of a day? What's the intervals? Is a continuous infusion better? What about maintenance? Like do you give it every week, every month? Like ketamine questions. Psychotherapy, is it necessary, and if so, what kind? There's an emphasis on psychological support in order to scale up psychedelic psychotherapy, but those providing support are trained folks. So if you've got a retreat center or or a healing center, what are the qualifications of those providing psychological support? I think it's important to include psychotherapy. And to call a spade, you need psychotherapy to make the most of a psychedelic experience. So the beings, we apprehend them in our mind, but where do they reside? And after all, what does it matter? Like if they're our brain on drugs, or if they're from some outer space, other plane of existence, we still need to understand what they are trying to tell us. And I think ultimately, like I do speculate, kind of in a wild-eyed manner toward the end of the DMT book, maybe they reside in parallel universes or dark matter or whatnot. I think that's unlikely. I think they're mostly projections of our own mind, what's more or less conscious in our minds. In a way, we're looking in to a mirror which is amplified and distorted and revealed. Things may come up in our minds that are completely new, but there is an unconscious. That's been established for 100 years or so. So that might just be unconscious material bubbling up to the surface, and the garb that the visions or the beings take are um, are composed of the raw materials in our mind in the first place. Like if we never saw a car, let's let's say we're deep in the Amazon, and you take ayahuasca or you smoke and you smoke DMT, you're not going to be seeing beings driving in a car. They'll be driving in a canoe, and they'll be transmitting information to you in the form that you're able to perceive. So I think the more important thing is to learn how to get information from the beings, either if they exist on our own mind or someplace out there. Is what they are you communicating helpful? Can we understand it? How do we get the most information? What are the questions we want to ask? How do we integrate or interpret that information, as opposed to simply being floored by their presence? I'm a little concerned about the makings of a cult with the continuous infusion protocol. Uh, like, if you're convinced that these beings are spiritual beings from another level of reality, and you ask them to solve our problems, I think that can be problematic. Number one, if they are real, then how do we know that we can trust them? And if they aren't like objectively real, but only exist in our mind, we're only talking to ourselves. So I think to like make them freestanding things that we worship and give obeisance to and talk about and give names to, I think can get a little weird. So one of the ways I've understood psychedelics over the years has been helped by Aristotle's metaphysics, in which he divides the mind into two faculties, an imaginative one and an intellectual one. The imaginative faculty is everything but abstract thought. Uh, you know, Perceptual effects, emotional effects, somatic effects, even the intuition of the feeling that what you're witnessing is more real than real. The rational faculty, contains abstract, thought, ideas, concepts, and whatnot. So I think it's clear that psychedelics preferentially stimulate the imagination. The richness of the products in the imaginative faculty are much greater than the contents in the intellectual faculty. So you can stimulate the imagination, but how do you stimulate the intellect? Through study. You learn things. You have ideas. You've got different ideas about good and bad, true and false, good and evil, those kinds of things. So if you know what you're looking for, looking at, you know how to interact with the contents of that state. You can label it. You can ask, the beings, verbal, kinds of questions and understand, their answers. I think, that only occurs through, sober, study and intellectual, development. Okay, so I'm sorry to go so long.
No, you were bang on time. Thank you so much, Dr. Strassman, for this wonderful presentation. We now move to the panel discussion. So Zahar and I will just ask a few questions, and it will be really free flowing. So just Zahar, feel free to jump in whenever you want as well. So the first question I have for you, Dr. Strassman, is that, as you mentioned, there's a unique phenomenology to DMT, which is that people experience something that is more real than real, right? It's really special, that is unlike dreams or other psychedelics. Maybe some dreams are more real than real, but most dreams are not like that. And same thing
Right.
with other psychedelics. So there's something unique about the DMT that is metaphysically special in that sense. So sort of my question is, in the perennial understanding of the subtle energy systems, whether you go to yoga or Taoism, there is obviously extrasensory perceptions that they postulate through the chakras. And what are the chances that the DMT is activating ourselves to be in contact with these subtle realms? Obviously, it's not something that we can necessarily prove scientifically right now, or maybe we can. But what are your thoughts about DMT allowing us to go deeper into these extrasensory perception? Now, whether these beings are within the subconscious or within some other parallel reality, I think that becomes a verbal dispute, because so long as, if you understand the subconscious to be something collective or something so deep that we don't have awareness of, they're still significant in that sense. So I think that becomes a verbal question. But I think the more important question is, are they intelligent and are they interacting with us? If they are part of our psyche, but they're intelligent and they're interacting with us, still, I think we consider that to be important. So.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I also am indebted to the medievalists for is this notion of what's called the active intellect. They were interested in what's called a spherical emanation. You've got God, way up on top, and then you have nine spheres. From the more, the more subtle, to the more gross. the constellations, the stars, the planets, the moon, those kinds of things. The sphere in which we reside is called the sublunar sphere. It it begins at the moon, and the center is the center of the Earth. So that's that is all that we can comprehend. The contents of the higher spheres are incomprehensible. So uh, there's a notion of the active intellect, which is a repository of knowledge, of information, which occurs at the outskirts, as it were, the circumference, the periphery of that sphere. And it contains a record of everything from the past, everything in the present, and all possible future outcomes. So there's a notion, at least within the Jewish medieval tradition, that the prophetic experience, which is the highest spiritual state in the Hebrew Bible, which is quite DMT like. The prophetic experience um, consists of what's called cleaving to the active intellect. You can become close to it in the prophetic state, which is how the prophets are able to, number one, be the most accurate recorders of history, and also know what's going on everywhere, and be able to make predictions of the future. So uh, the conflating or the cleaving with the active intellect occurs via the imagination. And the imagination then contains images, visions, and voices, which are specific to that prophet in that time and place, um, and are from above, as it were. And then it was the function of the prophet to interpret those visions and those voices, to be able to then communicate them to the larger community.
Zahar, do you want to jump in?
Yeah. So I was just wondering, in those kind of states where a person can feel prophetic, like they feel like God, like they can see everything at once, is there any way to accurately determine whether a person is being deluded into thinking that they're in that state? Or is there any truth in that they can actually see everything?
I think it may feel that they can, but all because they feel that way, it doesn't mean that they are. Uh, I think one of the most salient characteristics of the psychedelic state is the feeling of meaningfulness, truthfulness, the convincing reality of what you are undergoing. And that doesn't mean that what you're convinced of is true or real or even good. Like, look at how Charles Manson used LSD, and his followers. He just fed them all kinds of nonsense, and they were sure it was true because of the meaning enhancing effect of LSD. Um, so if people feel that they've got a window to something divine or something true or prophetic or really cosmic, it requires peer review. Like, do other people think that? And if they don't, why not? And also, like in the case of prophecy, there's this notion of false prophecy, and the false prophet. How do you determine a true prophet from a false prophet? Um, and it's not really cut and dry, but there are some guidelines. One of which is what they're teaching consistent with the teachings within Judaism. For example, like if they're saying go worship idols, then that is not a true prophet. And their character as well. If they're raging alcoholics and molesters of children and thieves, you wouldn't necessarily consider them to be a true prophet. Because if they were tapped into some higher knowledge, you would think that they would be impeccable in their daily lives. So one of the things which occurs every so often is I get an email from somebody or their family or friends in cases of people smoking way too much DMT, and they have the answer. They know exactly what's going on. They want to help me answer my questions. And if only everyone listened, things would be great. And they're completely convinced, and they get angry when other people don't agree with them. Usually, these folks are in prison or in jail or in state hospitals, and they don't really see anything the matter with them. That's an extreme example, I suppose, of you being convinced of the reality of what you perceive on a psychedelic. Um, yeah, you need peer review. You need people pushing back on your assertions.
So the next question I have is, I watched a documentary a few years ago called DMT Quest, and it sort of hypothesized that perhaps with styles of breath work like supraventilation, when you breathe like very deeply, kind of, and then sort of squeeze your muscles, you can hypothetically send their cerebral spinal fluid up to the pineal gland. And again, this is really hypothetical. I'm not sure if it's 100% proven, but apparently there's a process called piezoelectricity whereby the pineal gland may secrete DMT through the cerebral spinal fluid, sort of pressurizing the pineal gland. I personally have had experiences through breath work where it does feel phenomenologically similar to DMT, even though it doesn't feel like a full-blown DMT experience. What are your thoughts, both experientially, maybe if you've tried breath work, and also scientifically, of our ability to create our own endogenous DMT with techniques like breath work?
Mm-hmm. Well, I've done, the holotropic breath work, and I can vouch for its effect. It's very psychedelic. It's just like that. You are hyperventilating, and all of a sudden you're in some other place. Yeah, it is quite psychedelic. Um, my experience was not DMT like. It was more like a big MDMA trip. But still, I was in a fully altered state. Um, yeah, the pineal, theory, I put that, forth in the DMT book, the spirit molecule. There's all the precursors for synthesis of DMT in the pineal. And, it's very, hard to stimulate the pineal gland, even to make melatonin. So I speculated that, with major, stress, you might be able to produce, DMT from the pineal. There was a 2013 paper from the Michigan lab, suggesting there was DMT in the living rodent pineal. But as it turns out, their later, studies weren't able to find DMT in the pineal gland itself, only in the surrounding tissue, which was probably the result of the probe snagging brain tissue on the way in and out. So the role of the pineal in making DMT is still up in the air. Concentrations in the pineal would be rather low, but still, if it were secreted directly into the CSF, the spinal fluid, you could have effects. But I think subsequently we now know that DMT in the cortex is quite high. It's as high as serotonin and dopamine. So I think it's way more interesting, that the brain makes high levels of DMT all the time compared as opposed to the pineal gland making DMT under extraordinary circumstances. The mechanics or what stimulates or what slows down the production of endogenous DMT, we still don't know. There are physiological, there's acid and base pH changes in the blood and spinal fluid from hyperventilating or holding your breath. Those are the kinds of questions which you could be addressed once we you can visualize DMT synthesis. My kind of stock answer with respect to the role of endogenous DMT in non-drug states is that to the extent the non-drug state resembles what happens when you give DMT, then it makes sense to believe that endogenous DMT is playing a role.
Especially if there aren't that many endogenous psychedelics within our brain. The only one is DMT, right? We have cannabinoid receptors, but
Right.
the breath work doesn't feel like a cannabis experience. It feels more like a DMT experience.
That's right. Well, so 5-methoxy DMT is endogenous, but there's almost no interest in looking at its presence in brain at this point.
So, sorry, is there any reason that NN-DMT became uh, the more research psychedelic rather than other compounds like 5-MeO-DMT? Was it
Mhm.
easier to extract, or was it purely because of the experiential effects of it?
I think it was more expedient. It was studied in humans in Hungary and the U.S. And given safely. Uh, very weird. Very short acting. It's endogenous. Uh, there was interest in its role in schizophrenia, back in the 70s and the 60s. And that was one of the reasons that I chose DMT to study as opposed to 5-methoxy, because I'd have to go back to the drawing board and do animal studies because there weren't any human studies published on it. Um, yeah, so, and it was obscure. I began with it instead of LSD or psilocybin. I knew if I started doing this research with LSD, there'd be a lot of media attention, and I didn't want that. And Terence McKenna was quite active in those days, touting DMT. He wasn't touting 5-methoxy DMT. And 5-methoxy was only discovered, gosh, in the maybe 1980s, 1970s, in um, as occurring in the venom glands of the desert toad. It really wasn't known to be psychedelic up until then. So DMT had a much longer history within the research and the recreational drug world.
So another question I have is, I think you're aware of the Kundalini awakening, the phenomenology of Kundalini awakening. There's a lot of like the body shakes. There's a lot of release of emotions, and there's like the dark night of the soul, which leads into an experience of oneness and bliss states. Obviously, there's a lot more to say about Kundalini awakening, but I think it's a process of like union. Like yoga means union, to become one with whatever it is that you're becoming one with. Now, DMT, as you said, doesn't necessarily cause ego dissolution, but I think higher doses may do that. But there seems to be some overlap between the phenomenology of DMT and Kundalini awakening. Do you think there's any good reason to believe they're interconnected to some way? Maybe the Kundalini is a whole transformation, spiritual, energetic, physical, and the DMT is a component within this transformation. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, well, it's similar to the answer that I gave, which is to the extent that the syndromes overlap, there could be a role for the naturally occurring compound.
So with kind of more traditional psychedelics like LSD and psilocybin, um, can you predict what will happen experientially within a DMT trip in a similar way, or is it completely unique? Like how you'd predict a dream, for example. Like if I spend a whole day cooking food, for example, there's a high chance that I will dream about cooking a meal. Is DMT similar, or is it more like traditional psychedelics?
Um, let's see. Well, do you mean is there like a connection between everyday life and one's DMT experiences?
Yeah, or is DMT completely its own thing, or how much does real life affect
Influence
DMT?
it, yeah. Um, well, yeah, I think it can't help but be influenced by one's everyday life. I mean, if you're reading the newspaper and then you smoke DMT, you're probably going to have content that's related to what you were reading about. Like if you're reading about the current political situation in the U.S. and you smoke DMT, it's going to be an apocalyptic trip most likely, and end of the world. What's the point? All those kinds of things. Um, you know, marching goose step soldier types. Yeah. So yeah, I think Stan Groff used to describe uh, psychedelics as non-specific amplifiers of the unconscious, but I think they're more, generally non-specific amplifiers of the psyche, both the conscious, preconscious, and unconscious. And, those are 100% personal. They're based on your experiences and your, and your biological makeup.
So with DMT, is there kind of a message that the molecule kind of provides? Because I've personally heard accounts from people who have taken psilocybin or LSD, and a lot of them report seeing or hearing or experiencing the same kind of message. Does DMT have something like that, or is it completely unique to every individual?
What's that message?
With LSD, for example, people can experience oneness with the whole universe, like total synesthesia, and in the end, after you die, you become one with everything. So you shouldn't be afraid of death, for example, like with LSD. With psilocybin, I think it was something along the lines of um, live life to the fullest, chase after your goals because you only have one life. Does DMT have something similar, or is it completely unique?
Well, I think those messages are not dependent on the drug. I think they're dependent on the person and their environment. Um, yeah, I mean, the idea that after you die, you merge with the oneness. I mean, where's the data? Uh, yeah, I mean, that's a nice thought, but I mean, is it true? Um, I think DMT is unique in what happens for a couple of reasons. One is that it's just so fast, and you don't really have time to prepare. Um, and the other is you dissociate. You're out of your body, or you lose awareness of your body. And there's a feeling of it being more real than real, which I think is a biologically determined effect. I think there's some parts of the brain that mediate our sense of reality, and that DMT really dings those part of the those parts of the brain. Even though people will often will often state after they've used DMT the first time, things like, I never could have expected this. There's no way I could have imagined this. This is completely out of my realm of experience or expectation. That may be true, for the phenomenology, the world of light, the beings, all that. But, the message itself, I think, is dependent on the person. If they're struggling with work, they may get some insights about work. If they are struggling in a relationship or some kind of problem with creativity, that'll be that'll be transmitted in a way that may be difficult to decipher. But it still is 100% dependent on that person.
The next question I have is, I think the key brainwave pattern for DMT is high gamma waves, and gamma waves are associated with meditators who have been meditating for 30 years, and is connected with like flow states, being really cognitively and emotionally engaged with the task at hand. It's just really interesting that most drugs make you high, but DMT feels like it's not actually making you high. It is making you more. It is increasing your capacity as a human being whatever those capacities are, because the brain is in gamma waves, is really engaged and is processing a lot of information. What are your thoughts on the implication of this observation?
Well, I don't really stay current on the electrophysiology and the functional your brain imaging. My feeling is that those studies simply attach objective data to subjective experience. So you can feel certain ways on DMT, certain things happen to you. If other things happened when you were on DMT and you looked at the functional imaging data or the EEG data, it would simply say, this is what happens when you're in that state. So I don't mean to disregard those data, but they simply are, they're kind of like add-ons. We don't experience elevated gamma activity. We experience elevated wellness or wholeness, or we can meditate better. And that would be the case even if gamma wave activity were not affected. So in some ways, I'm not really convinced those are useful data. It's cool. And the images are great. And they confirm that there is something going on correlating objectively with your subjective experience, but it is tied to the subjective experience, not the other way around. Like if you just put someone in a machine and you stimulated their gamma activity, would that be a psychedelic effect? Well, it might have some features shared with a psychedelic experience, but it would be like a facsimile of a psychedelic state. It really wouldn't be a full psychedelic experience.
So just subjectively, a lot of people report that they do feel like they're experiencing their capacity, whether it's cognitive, emotional capacity, is increasing rather than decreasing. Most drug effects have this effect of, not all drugs, but a lot of drugs have the effect of like decreasing certain capacities. Like DMT seems like it's increasing certain capacities, like cognitive, emotional. So is it actually maybe temporarily allowing us to tap into a fuller potential of what it means to be a human being? Or, yeah.
Well, if you look at the neurogenesis data, neuroplasticity data, most of the psychedelics stimulate neuroplasticity, neurogenesis, DMTs, psilocybin, LSD. I think even ketamine and MDMA do. So you have to do something with that neuroplasticity. Like you could go to a monastery after your psilocybin trip. Well, and those neuroplasticity effects, depending on the drug, can last a few days, maybe even a couple of weeks in the case of psilocybin. So that's what's referred to as a critical window, critical learning period. You're most open to new input. So you could go to a monastery for a couple of weeks after a big psilocybin experience, and you could channel the new growth of those neurons into your practice. Or for those 2 weeks, you could channel that new growth into enhanced psychotherapeutic effects. Or you can go to a neo-Nazi summer camp and get more convinced and more dedicated to right-wing causes. So I don't think automatically that these drugs are useful in that way, making you more good. It just depends what you do with it. The set and the setting, and that's important afterwards as well. Because of the critical period.
So kind of going off of that, there was another talk that described that psychedelics help people more when it's described as an innately mystical experience. How would you describe whether a psychedelic experience is mystical or not?
Well, I mean, there's a number of things. That's not necessarily true. That, well, I guess, let's see. Um, Mystical experiences in a lab are determined by scores on a rating scale. So to to call or to equate scores on a rating scale that occur in a lab after being given a drug as a mystical experience, which is a theological term. Your mystical experiences occur within religious contexts, secular contexts, but not in the same way as the religious context. Your mystical experiences in religious contexts are not the goal. They're confirmation that you're on the right path. So it isn't like you have a mystical experience as a Zen Buddhist monk and you retire. You have a mystical, like, Kensho, an enlightenment experience, and your teacher, number one, confirms it, and number two, it's like, okay, now for the hard work. After that mystical experience, so you have some confirmation that you're doing things right, but it doesn't mean that you're done. It just means that, okay, you've looked in the mirror and you've said, ugh, and now you have to start working on yourself within that model. So if you give somebody a drug and their scores are high on a rating scale, that's not the same thing as one that occurs in the natural world, as it were. I think it's a mistake to throw theological notions in with clinical research notions. Because then you're using science to promulgate a religious belief, which I think is very dangerous. And that religious belief is that there's a core religious experience to all the major religions, which is false. That's not true. And look at Judaism. There's not one case of a mystical unitive ego death experience in the entire Hebrew Bible. So when you're talking about a universal religion, you have to ask, whose universal religion is it? And what happens if you don't believe in it? Are you a heretic? Are you screwed? So I think, that it's a bit of a Trojan horse, and in a way that, Trojan horse has invaded the world of clinical research by means of this mystical experience questionnaire. Everybody uses it. And everybody demonstrates the higher the scores, the better you do. But if you look more carefully at the clinical research, it's most likely the intensity of the effect, rather than its flavor. Is it chocolate? Is it vanilla? Is it strawberry? It's the intensity. You could most likely give psychosis rating scales in these studies, and I will, and I am convinced, and I am willing to be disproven, that schizophrenia scores, if they go super high, will correlate with improvement in depression and improvement in end of life distress or improvement in OCD. So it isn't like you have a mystical experience, is that you give that rating scale and it's really high. And then you say, oh, it must be the mystical experience. So I'm rather skeptical of the whole endeavor, as you might discern.
So there's no accurate way to determine like so there's no scientific basis for the word mystical. It's just kind of something that people say completely subjectively.
Well, it's a conflating of religion and science,
Yeah.
which I don't think is ever a good thing. I mean, you could call it a peak experience. You can call it a fully psychedelic experience, but you don't have to call it a religious experience. That's a slippery slope.
Can you call it a oneness experience?
Well, you could, but those ego dissolving oneness states are quite rare most of the time in most people's psychedelic experiences on most psychedelic drugs. 5-methoxy DMT is known for the white light ego dissolving effect, but even if there may be like a moment of ego dissolution in other drug experiences, um, 98% percent of the time, you're 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 dealing with the content of the experience. There's your emotions, there's your memories, and um, you're relating, you know, um, to the experience. You're not, dissolving into it. Bill Richards, the psychologist at Hopkins who wrote Sacred Knowledge, he compares the interactive relational state, specifically within the Hebrew Bible, and the mystical unitive state of Eastern religions and the New Age. And he refers, to the mystical experience as being on the mountaintop, and the interactive relational states are the foothills. According to who? So I think there's this, bias. Also I think with the mystical unitive state, it's really prone to misuse, because it is ego dissolving. There's no words. You come down and you say, "Oh, this is what it meant," and you can make up whatever you want. You could say, "I saw God. I felt God. I now know what I need to do with my life," as opposed to the interactive relational state where there's content exchange, there's information, there's words, there's verbal communication. You don't make that up as after you've come down. You're forced to deal with what you heard or what you were told. So I think an emphasis on the mystical unitive state uh, leads to the potential of abuse in a way, because you could say that means you must start my foundation with $25 million. But if heard on psilocybin being saying to you, "Don't raise money, that's bad," then you can't say when you come down, "Oh, I think this means I have to fundraise." So I think the work involved in deciphering and working with the interactive relational state that's full of content is way more, at least potentially, valuable than basking in the bliss of an ego dissolved state. Also, I think that ego dissolving state can be addictive. I know people who just love to smoke 5-MeO DMT because all their cares disappear. It's just all love, it's all white light, it's all God. And they come down and things aren't so great, and they just smoke it a lot.
That's an interesting addiction, to be addicted to 5-MeO DMT. But yeah, thank you so much, Dr. Strassman. So now we move on to audience questions. Most of our audience are with Zahar. So Zahar, if you don't mind asking the audience if they have any questions.
Yeah.
I was quite interested when you spoke about Jewish mysticism, and I was thinking with what you said about the interactive space, the relational space where you exchange information, and how our intellect feeds into that experience. What would you say, maybe personally or just in general, your experience with this knowledge of mysticism and this idea of the microcosm and the microcosm and the mirror of the psyche? How is that, if that affects in any way the information we get from the state, or if that is another Trojan horse, as you would say, or would it be helpful in this conversation?
Let's see. Well, I mean, can you simplify the question? It was a little over my head.
It's just a general question about, you spoke about the dangers of religion and how it can muddle the science. I was just thinking more on a personal level, how has knowledge of religion affected your conversations or the knowledge you get from the experience?
Yeah. Well, personally, uh, well, there's three legs to to any psychedelic experience. There's the set and the setting and the dose of the drug. And in the DMT book, actually, even back then, 25 years ago, I kind of joke half-heartedly saying, "Well, the one you can dispense with is the drug." The set, and the setting determine your life than any than at least necessarily uh, any drug experience. So I'm not studying psychedelics anymore. I gave my last dose of anything maybe 30 years ago now. And instead, I've been looking more into, what are any altered states, good for? If so, so what? If you can trip out on a psychedelic drug, so what? Are you a better person? Is the world a better place? So my emphasis, for the last, 30 years or so, has been, looking at other models than the psychological or the biological for making the most of any altered state. And for me, I've found some resonance in studying the Hebrew Bible and the prophetic state and the prophetic message. The Hebrew language is very cool. So one of the pieces of advice I give for integration is to occupy yourself with things that remind you of how you felt during the best parts of your psychedelic experience. So if reading something kind of brings back some tingles of your psychedelic experience, obviously there's something in what you're reading. So dig deeper into that. So I looked at the biological model for the message. What are these states good for? And then the mystical experience didn't really cut it for me. It's not grounded in any theological disciplines or with any rigor. The physics, alternate reality, dark matter, parallel universe, models were only mechanistic. They could explain, how these states might might occur. So I kind of went back to the drawing board and thought, well, let's look at the religious traditions out there which have occupied themselves for thousands of years with altered states and making the most of them. So for me personally, being Jewish, I was attracted to the Hebrew Bible. So yeah, I think we need to be better people to make a better world, and just tripping isn't going to do that. I think we need to have some intention in making the world a better place. So I think that if you're a careful student of the religions out there, you might be able you know to do that better than the psychological models which are in vogue. If that helps answer your question.
Thank you so much.
If anyone else wants to come up.
So I was wondering, when you hear people talk about the DMT world, it's often described as being higher dimensional or some sort of like hyperspace, and you interact with higher dimensional beings. And I was wondering, is this meant in the sense because when you speak of higher dimensional, sometimes people use it in the more layman pop culture sense of some higher plane of existence, or you're interacting with some higher spiritual plane and beings, or is it meant in the more geometric, mathematical, Euclidean way where we live in 3 dimensions and the DMT world has maybe a 4th or a 5th spatial dimension? And I was wondering in which sense higher dimensional is meant.
Well, I'm not really sure how to answer that. In our questionnaire, we ask people to describe the visual characteristics of what they saw. And one of the options is one-dimensional. Another option, two-dimensional, three-dimensional, and beyond dimensionality. And usually after the high dose, they would check the beyond dimensionality box. But that was more of an intuition than anything deduced by rational experimentation. Yeah, one of my colleagues is a mathematician who in the 1960s smoked, 4 ounces of DMT over the space of a year. Very smart guy. Used to spend a lot of time in India in the caves and things, and he was convinced after all that DMT that the world is made of vibrations. And he set out to create the field of visual mathematics, which he basically did uh, single-handedly. His name is uh, Ralph Abraham, and he's still around. And he would be much more able to describe the mathematical dimensional objectivity or subjectivity of the hyperdimensional effects of DMT.
Thank you very much.
You should get him on your circuit.
Thank you. Thank you for the response.
Mm.
We have time for a few more questions, maybe 2 or 3 more questions.
Hello. So you mentioned that when you were giving these people DMT for your studies, mostly they experience like pretty consistent things. They all mentioned like this world of light that they entered. I was interested if there were any like strange outliers, people whose experience did not line up with like anyone else in the study, and what those people's experiences were like.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, there were 2 people that, there was one person in particular who had no response to a big dose of DMT. We infused it, and he opened up his eyes and he said, "Are you done?" And we said, "Yeah." And we looked at his arm, and it had gone into his vein. No blood pressure response, no subjective response. The same vial of DMT we had been giving that week to other volunteers, zero response. And back in the day, I believed that spiritual people produced more DMT than everybody else. And I was thinking about that story that Ram Dass liked to tell about giving his Indian guru 1,000 micrograms of LSD, and nothing happened. And I thought, well, I wonder if you give a really spiritually developed person DMT, that they wouldn't have any response to it. This guy was a bartender, never meditated, liked to swim, very normal guy. Yeah, and every so often I will hear from people who smoke a lot of DMT with their friends. Their friends are completely under the influence, and they have no effect at all. And they're normal everyday folks. So I think what may be going on is a mutation in their serotonin receptor, specifically the 2A receptor, like a single nucleotide polymorphism, a SNP. And I've tried to interest the world's expert on SNPs and the 2A receptor, fellow in North Carolina, Brian Roth. And I've said, I have a handful of people that have contacted me over the years, and one of my old volunteers who have no response to DMT. Would you look at their receptors? I think that would be a very easy experiment to do if if you had the technology in your lab. But for everybody else, if they got enough DMT, they entered into a world of light, and it was psychedelic. The content might differ, but the general shape of that world was the same.
Thank you.
We have time for one more question. So.
No. I wanted to ask, given DMT's activity on the sigma-1 receptor and its potential roles in neuroprotection, anti-inflammatory signaling, synaptic plasticity, and mitochondrial stabilization, do you see a therapeutic future for DMT microdosing or even regular DMT dosing integrated into treatment in conditions like Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, stroke recovery, or even addiction?
Yeah. There's quite a bit of interest in, the neurological benefits of psychedelics, including DMT. Um, I was consulting with a group in Canada. It's a company which is called Algernon, and they're looking at a slow or a low continuous infusion of uh, DMT, a non-psychedelic dose, to see if it would help either reduce acute stroke size and or speed functional recovery during physical therapy. I think there's interest in using psychedelics in Alzheimer's, because of its effects on neurogenesis and neuroplasticity. I heard from someone just a few days ago who who you may have ALS and was interested in whether microdosing would be helpful. Um, you could use microdosing of psychoactive psychedelics, or you can use these non-psychedelic psychedelics, which are very potent 2A receptor agonists, which stimulate neurogenesis and neuroplasticity without behavioral effects in lower animals anyway. Yeah, I would imagine some of these are being studied in humans, but there aren't any data out there yet. There's a congener ibogaine, which is called TBG, and there's that ISO DMT I was mentioning. Those affect the 2A site, and may be neurologically beneficial without behavioral effects. Dave Olson, the expert that I mentioned from UC Davis, just recently published a paper describing the neuroplastic effects of an LSD congener, which seems free of any behavioral effects. So I think there is going to be a niche filled by either microdosing psychedelic compounds or mega dosing non-psychedelic ones.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Strassman, for coming to talk with us. It's been wonderful having you. Zahara and I are both extend you a big gratitude for coming to speak with us. We'd love to have you in the future, either online or in person. And yeah, Zahara, if you have anything else to add.
No, I'm just saying a big thank you from me and from everyone else watching here. I really personally enjoyed the talk. I found it quite fascinating. It's kind of like a dream come true because I got into kind of the psychedelics and now I'm speaking to like the pioneers of the research. So it's quite wonderful. So thank you very much from me and from everyone else at St Andrews Psychedelic Society.
Yeah, you're very welcome. Thanks again for the invitation. It was fun.